Hello there. Welcome to Crime Prevention Works. I'm Tessie Ajala. We focus on refugee and immigrant issues on Crime Prevention Works because refugees are already victims of crime. That's one of our points of discussion on this show today. They live in your community, they are legal immigrants, and they need your help. There are several million refugees in refugee camps around the world, and the United States government, through the Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, and the Department of Health and Human Services, reach out to refugees in refugee camps around the world. And they resettle a tiny fraction of them here in the United States, according to the President's determination. In 2007, I was invited by the former director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, Martha Newton, to produce and direct the first short documentation of the history of the United States Office of Refugee Resettlement. In an effort to project the work of refugee resettlement and to enlighten our community members about refugees as legal immigrants, I produced and directed this short documentary that you will be seeing momentarily in commemoration of the national consultation of the Office of Refugee Resettlement in 2007. Watch.
It is the policy of the United States to admit to this country refugees of special humanitarian concern. Our country's core values and America's tradition of being a safe haven for the oppressed built the foundation for today's domestic refugee resettlement program. Following the admission of over 250,000 displaced Europeans after World War II, the first refugee legislation was enacted by the United States Congress, the Displaced Persons Act of 1948. Later, laws provided for admission of persons fleeing from communist regimes to the United States, largely from Hungary, Poland, Yugoslavia, and Korea. In the 1960s, several hundred thousand fled from Cuba. The fall of Vietnam in April 1975 produced even more refugees. This large influx of refugees created the need to provide an orderly system of services and programs for domestic resettlement in the United States. As a result, the Refugee Act of 1980 was signed into law on March 17, 1980. This act provided the permanent statutory authority for United States refugee policies and programs. This act created the Office of Refugee Resettlement, or ORR, under the Administration for Children and Families, located within the United States Department of Health and Human Services. Since the Refugee Act came into existence in 1980, the United States has resettled more than 2.4 million refugees. The Office of Refugee Resettlement has evolved over the years under the leadership of the following individuals. In 2006, Martha E. Newton was appointed as director of ORR. Martha crafted a new generation of refugee resettlement initiative, and she recently led ORR through the most significant repatriation process in the history of ORR.
Thank you all for being with us here today. The theme of our consultation is a new generation of refugee resettlement. And in order for us to focus on the challenges that face us in the future, it's important that we acknowledge the past, the tremendous work of all of those who have come before us. And I want to give a special thank you to all of those individuals who are here with us today. We're a changing world, and a new generation represents not only the changing populations that we serve, but also the people who are doing the work. Nearly 1/3 of the workforce of ORR is new in the last 3 years, myself included. A changing world and a new generation also requires that we be innovators and risk takers. So I want to thank all the founders, the innovators, the risk takers, for all the tremendous work you have done to get the Office of Refugee Resettlement where it is today. We salute you.
Over its more than quarter-century history, ORR has recorded milestone achievements with a variety of initiatives and leadership. There are many other stakeholders that have played historic and important roles in domestic refugee resettlement. And we all know that in order to know where you are going, you have to know where you have come from. Ed Silverman is one of the founding fathers of ORR.
Well, I've been administering refugee services since the fall of Saigon in 1975. We've had a long-term partnership, and I've watched ORR grow and develop and keeps getting better and better.
Well, the Refugee Act was passed in 1980, and the expectation was that this would provide a legislative framework for dealing with refugee populations for the foreseeable future, in fact, for the indefinite future. And that happened in early 1980, and in April of 1980, we experienced the influx of 125,000 or so persons fleeing both Cuba and Haiti. But because they had their refugee credentials established or attempted to have them established when they arrived in the U.S. on U.S. soil, they didn't fit the terms of reference that were set forth in the Refugee Act of 1980, where refugees established their refugee bona fides overseas through a fairly elaborate processing mechanism. So the federal government had to immediately start recognizing that the Refugee Act did not cover totally the circumstances of Cuban-Haitian entrance, as the designation was finally given to them, since the refugee term didn't seem to apply, or at least the U.S. government didn't think that it applied. And so that became an important part of the early work of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and it was totally unanticipated. And I was very much involved in that as Director of Operations, and had a lot to do with working with friends in the state of Florida and in New York State, the two states that received most of the refugees, New York in particular receiving large numbers of Haitians, but obviously South Florida was the major recipient of the Cuban-Haitian influx. So building service delivery mechanisms for that population and figuring out how to provide them with services led to a legislative amendment called the Fussell-Stone Amendment that basically gave them the same kind of coverage that refugees got under the Refugee Act. And I was very much involved in the work that happened to make the Cuban-Haitian program become a way of assisting Cuban and Haitian entrant.
I think ORR, one of ORR's greatest achievements is providing leadership for the domestic program. And before my time, really worked on revamping the entire teaching of English in the United States. Prior to ORR's emphasis on workplace English, English was taught as if you were studying high school Spanish, and people were not very effective at moving out in the community with good English in a very short time. So that was a great accomplishment, and you can see reverberating throughout the nation.
I first started in 1980 with the Cubans at Fort McCoy. That was one of a number of different locations that were used. There was Fort Indian Down Gap, there was Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. In fact, when the Cubans were first coming in, they filled up the Orange Bowl down in Miami. At Fort McCoy, there were some 15,000 Cubans that were processed through there. Years later, following that, I was down in Miami setting up a program for Haitian unaccompanied minors, and we processed some 170 there very quickly. In the aftermath of the first war with Iraq, there was a crisis with Iraqi Kurds. Now, the Kurds that were in the northern Iraq had a problem in that normally they would set up a refugee camp in one of the neighboring countries. Well, the Kurds are a problem for Iraq, they're a problem for Iran, they're a problem for Turkey, and a number of countries, so they selected Guam as the place to reprocess them. And we did processing for some 7,000 Iraqi Kurds. And during that time, we actually had 2 typhoons and 2 earthquakes come through to add a little spice to the whole program.
The support that was given early in the history of the program to the formation of community-based organizations, refugee community-based organizations, empowering refugees and giving them a stake, making them legitimate stakeholders by giving them resources, technical assistance, and training to form what we have commonly called mutual assistance associations. But they're community-based organizations that empower refugees, are led by refugees, and work for refugees.
During my tenure, I think there were a few things that I'm rather proud of. One is the extension of OR benefits to asylees upon being granted asylum, and that's made a significant difference in thousands of lives. Another was the extension of medical benefits regardless of employment and income eligibility through the 9-month period. That sounds a little technical, but what it really meant was people could get a job and still keep their medical benefits, which I think was really important.
Empowering the states as stakeholders. Initially, every state had a state refugee office that organized services with voluntary agencies and with other service providers to continue the services that refugees received initially through reception and placement grants that were administered by the Department of State. But the Office of Refugee Resettlement built that infrastructure of service delivery with states as the principal stakeholders to ensure that refugees had a longer period of transition so that they could make the transition to not necessarily full self-sufficiency, but could move themselves along toward a point that they could begin to take care of their own needs and negotiate for service.
We are in the business of preventing crime before they occur on this show. And that begs the question, what can we do to help prevent human trafficking and the victims of trafficking? Here is what Martha had to say about that as well.
The kind of, what would that look like? Would there be guards? If you saw someone and they looked like, they might need assistance, but they didn't say anything. You see someone, they're never allowed to leave. Helping people to say, look beneath the surface, that we want to be able to help rescue and restore victims of trafficking.
And in closing, ladies and gentlemen, we all live in the United States because this country is a beacon of hope for the oppressed around the world. And we stand by her, and we will protect our communities by working together. Yes, we will, and sure we can. I have been producing crime prevention works on public access television since 2004, and we will continue to utilize television to showcase community crime prevention professionals, programs and services that aid the prevention of crime, and the various law enforcement agencies, all in an attempt to create more awareness and to keep our communities safe. We must continue to work together with the good guys to make America safer than ever. Thank you for watching. I will talk to you soon.